There are many groups with a particular culture of their own who take that culture with them wherever they go, in culturally very different kinds of societies.
And that culture that they take with them, that could either work for them or it could work against them. Understand, right? It could be their enemy or their ally, right? And that's depending on the practices of that culture and how they use it to navigate the society that they're in, right? So let's learn about groups who have had cultures that have worked as their allies. Here we go.
Germans, for example, have for centuries had both a very specific set of skills and a very specific way of life, whether they lived in Germany, Brazil, Russia, Australia, or the United States. Cultures include not only customs, values, and attitudes, but also skills and talents that more directly affect economic outcomes, and which economists call human capital.
Skills and talents, these are part of people's culture, right? And they directly affect how much money people make. And so people with skills that society finds highly valuable, that means that they have a higher chance of making more money, right? And people with lower skills, it just has the opposite result. And so the skills and talents, along with people's customs, values, and attitudes, these are known as human capital by economists, right? And so this is basically what you bring to the table, right? And how a group presents themselves to the world, and how groups solve the many problems that they encounter in what is called the game of life, right? And so each group, they have a culture that is unique, right, in its own way. And their cultures are specialized in areas in which they value the most, right? And so because groups have different areas of specialization, they have different skills that they contribute to society, right? So for example, the Germans, they have been good at making pianos, right? And so according to Dr. Thomas Sowell, they built the first pianos in colonial America, right? And they led the piano making industry in Australia, France, Russia, and England, right? And so the Germans, they were skilled in warfare also, right? They were generals way back in the Roman army. They were generals in Russia and South America, right? And in the United States. Right? They had people that were skilled as the warlords.
Social patterns among Germans likewise appeared not only in Germany, but also in other countries around the world, in cultural environments that differed radically from one another. More was involved than differences in skills, important as such differences have been. Behind such skills are cultural values that give a priority to the acquisition of those skills, and new skills as the old ones become obsolete over time, making the mastering of new skills imperative.
And that's the key, the cultural value to give priority in learning those particular skills. So for example, the Germans, just like everyone else, they have a certain amount of time in the day, right? And they also have a long list of desires that they would like to do, right? But in order for them to excel in the piano making industry, optics, and military, they had to prioritize those types of things, right? Or bring those desires to the top of their to-do list, right? In other words, they had to make sacrifices, right? And a sacrifice requires that something has to be given up or not done to a significant degree, right? And so we all make sacrifices to a certain extent, but sometimes we sacrifice the more important things for the less important things, right? And which works against our best interest. Understand? And so the Germans, they place a high value on prioritizing those fields for occupations. And as a result, they got good at them, which is what is expected, right? Since anyone who keeps doing something for any extended period of time, they're bound to get good at it, right? That's just how it goes, right? And the Germans, they were good at this no matter what location they went to, right? They brought those skills with them, just as other groups have done so in the past, right? And that's one of the reasons why people who can live in the same external environment could have very different outcomes, right? They have different skills, different values, and different ways of approaching life.
The external environment, whether geographic or social, can be an influence but not predestination. Different groups living in the same external environment can have very different productivity if their internal cultural values produce very different priorities as to what they want to do, and at what sacrifices of other things.
You see that? The inner values play a huge role in the outcomes, right? So what people have going on in their inner world, that matters, right? Their thoughts, their internal dialogues, the things that they feel most important to them, right? The way that they imagine themselves, right? Their approach to the problems and hard times in life, right? And a whole host of other internal workings all factor into what other people prioritize over other things that they want to do or say that they want to do, right? And that's one of the reasons why people in the same environment have different results, right? And so I remember when I was in the Marines, all of the Marines that I had worked with, we all had the same opportunity to go to college, right? And guess how much it cost to go to college? Nothing, right? Because it was free as far as the money goes, right? And so I was the only person of all the Marines that I knew who went and finished my bachelor's degree while we were in the Marines. That's because I had different internal values, right? I knew before going into the Marines that I was going to finish college, right? It was a top priority for me, right? And I was going to do whatever I needed to do in order to accomplish that mission. No excuses accepted, right? And so what that meant was working more than full time as a Marine, right? And then being a full-time student at the same time, right? And guess what? I didn't care. Why? Because nobody else cared, right? Everyone had their own personal problems and issues that they had going on. And so nobody cared about where somebody came from or how hard of a life somebody had, right? No one cares, right? And so the only option I had was to do whatever it was I needed to do. And so I spent the vast majority of my free time doing college work until I finished my degree, right? And so what were the rest of the Marines doing? Exactly what enlisted Marines do, right? They were going out, drinking, partying, fighting, chasing women, right? And that's what they do, right? At least the vast majority of them. And so remember I told you that the cost to go to college was free? Well, it actually wasn't. That's because the cost to go to college meant sacrificing the typical Marine experience of drinking, partying, chasing women, right? And that was a price that they were not willing to pay. Understand clearly. And so they did what they valued most at that time, and I did what mattered most to me, right? And so we left out of the Marine Corps with different outcomes, although we were in the same environment, right? Our internal values were different, right? And so it is with some of the groups that come to America, and then they find themselves living in poverty amongst other groups, right? Many of these groups, they have a completely different mindset, worldview, and values, which cause them to create completely different outcomes, right? Even when living in the same poverty-stricken environment as the others, right? And you'll be surprised just to know what exactly is going on in the minds of other people. And when you understand some of these people's thought patterns, then you'll be able to understand how it is that they're able to do some of the things that they do.
An emphasis on education was a cultural pattern found in Germany itself, where kindergartens originated and where research universities were developed that were later imitated in the United States. 19th century Germany was one of the first European nations to have free and compulsory education, as well as more teachers per capita than in many other European countries, and with a higher proportion of the national output being devoted to education.
Let's pay close attention to Germany and their cultural approach towards education, right? They were the ones who introduced America to the concept of kindergarten, right? And people in position in America at that time, they were smart. And they did what? They adopted that practice. Now, why did they adopt that practice? Because they saw a benefit of having kindergarten, right? Did it matter who created it first or who came up with the idea? No, because what was more important was if it worked and if implementing it would bring America closer to the goals that the people had in mind for this society. And so when it stops working, or if something is found to be better and that comes along, then we just stop doing kindergarten and we do whatever's better, right? It's as simple as that. And so the Germans, as we can see, they have a history of placing a high value on education. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell, he talks about how in the Austrian Empire in the 1900s, the Germans had only about 5% of the males over the age of 10 that couldn't read, right? And other Europeans, such as the Polish, they had 67% of the people who couldn't read, right? And the Romanians had a 71% illiteracy rate, right? All while being European and living in the same environment, right? That's because culture matters.
Given the cultural differences that these groups take with them wherever they go, there is no reason whatever to expect them to have the same incomes or wealth, either compared to each other or compared to the existing majority populations of the countries to which they immigrate. nor do the empirical data show any such equality. That this is a matter of culture rather than a matter of initial wealth upon arriving in a given country is shown by how many groups have arrived in various countries far poorer than the existing population of the host country, and have nevertheless eventually risen above the economic level of those who were there before them.
This just reinforces the point that we talked about earlier. How some of these groups living in these poor areas, they have a completely different culture, right, than the people who surround them. And so the money that they have, it may be just as low as the people who are around them. But a lot of the times they have a mindset that is completely different, and it's on a completely different frequency. And because they think in different ways and they have different internal values and beliefs, they carry out very different actions that create very different outcomes than the surrounding people, right? And this is just the way it goes. It's the law of the land. It's the way of life. And we have to understand that, because these laws, they don't bend for anyone or any group, no matter how bad they believe their circumstance to be. It's just the way the thing goes, right? Because everyone has had it bad at some time or another. And so the Chinese, just like many other groups, they've had to overcome some grueling circumstances, right? And a lot of them, they've left their homelands for other countries, and they've had nothing more than the clothes on their backs, right? And they didn't know the language of the land that they were going to, or the customs of the people in that country that they were going to, right? And so the odds were stacked all the way against them. And so Dr. Thomas Sowell, he talks about how the Chinese were not given equal rights when they went into Southeast Asian countries, right? And also how in colonial Malaya, the British provided schools for the Malays, but the Chinese had to build their own, right? And he also talks about how in Peru, the Chinese had to shovel bird manure that was to be shipped as fertilizer, and how they had to do this in the grueling heat and stench. And also many of the Chinese, they were captured in holding pens to be sold as slaves and indentured servants all around the world, right? And he says this was by the hundreds of thousands, right? And so many of them, they died under crazy working conditions and being worked to death, right? And so many of the Chinese, they committed suicide during this time too. This is in the 19th century. And so the Chinese in many countries, they had some of the highest suicide rates, right? And the Chinese suicide rates was high in the United States as well, in places like San Francisco, where they had circumstances that were extremely unfavorable. And so it wasn't until after many years of grinding themselves out of the pit that they were finally able to achieve some type of prosperity, right? But prosperity for the Chinese wasn't always the case.
Poverty has also been a problem for hundreds of thousands of new Chinese immigrants arriving in the United States as late as the 21st century, whether legally or illegally from Fujian province in China. Like other immigrants in other times and places, the Chinese from Fujian have not scattered randomly across the United States, but have concentrated in their own communities, located in this case in Brooklyn, New York. These Fujianese have been described as really poor, as in 4 people to a single room, all rice diet, soda can collecting poor. They have crammed themselves into dorm-like quarters, working brutally long hours waiting tables, washing dishes and cleaning hotel rooms, and sending their Chinese-speaking children to the city's elite public schools and onto various universities.
You see that? 4 people to a room, all rice diet, soda can collecting poor. That's how poor the Fujianese immigrants from China were. And where did they settle? In Brooklyn, New York. With who? Together amongst themselves, right? But also among other poor people in that area. And what did they do? They worked long, hard hours, waiting tables, cleaning hotel rooms, and other low-paying jobs that many of the other people who were poor around that area, they probably did as well. But what was the difference? They were taking that little money that they had, and they were sending their children to elite public schools and universities, not taking the little money that they had and buying Jordans and the flyest outfits that the world has ever seen. This is a huge difference, right? And I want everyone watching right now to understand this clearly. The Fujianese, they were using their money to invest in their children's education. Why were they doing that? Because this is what they valued the most, right? That's one of the differences between them and the other poor people who stay stuck in that environment, right? They had a different mindset, and they were willing to spend every dime possible on educating their children so they can climb out of the pit.
It has been suggested facetiously that the first word of English these Fujianese learn is Harvard, and the second word is Stuyvesant, one of New York's elite and highly selective public high schools. While most of the students admitted to the city's elite public high schools come from middle-class or higher-income neighborhoods, a significant number come from lower-income neighborhoods where the Fujianese live. Fujianese parents often get their children tutored in order that they can do well on tests for admission to elite public high schools as gateways to good colleges and a better life.
Right? Because they take that little money that they have and they pay people to tutor their children, right? And in return, when those children become adults and have good careers, then they take care of their parents, right? And they help their parents navigate through the American system, right? And they do this as a thank you for the sacrifice that their parents made for them, right? And in one generation, that family has climbed out of the financial pit, right? And then they keep themselves surrounded with other people in that community that have done the same, right? And this is some pretty amazing stuff, right? And it's something to digest, something for your mind to think about, something to understand, right? And so this is the end of part 3 commentary on the book here, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. I want to thank you for watching until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you on the next video.